We are Community Radio Kilkenny City 88.7 FM.
Good afternoon, you are tuned and listening to the Woman to Woman show here on Community Radio Kilkenny City with me, Roisin the Cleric, on this bright, crisp Wednesday afternoon on the 26th of January. And that's the first month of 2022, nearly wrapped up. And now we're going to spring forward now into February. Last week on the Woman to Woman show, we were joined on the show by former Mayor and Labour County Councillor Mary Fitzpatrick, Niamh Murphy, the Communications Officer with the Amber Women's Refuge, and lecturer in equality and diversity human rights activist Stephanie McDermott, and Ola Kelly, chair of the Carlow, Kilkenny constituency of Fine Gael here in our city. We were discussing on how we need to change the narrative within society on domestic violence, gender-based violence, and women in general in our culture and in the communications of where we live and where we work. Over the last 2 years, we've been living through a global pandemic. However, for many women within our society and communities and within our workplace, there has been even more deadly pandemic within our society, and that is domestic violence and violence against women within our culture. However, many women and children have been living with the pandemic of misogyny, sexism and harassment, which reinforces each other along with domestic violence and domestic abuse within the sanctity of their own homes. Is it time now to end this societal pandemic and change the narrative of women we live in and experience gender violence physically, verbally, culturally through misogyny and sexism? Lisa Marge of Amber Women's Refuge tweeted, "Domestic violence isn't just a women's issue, it's a societal issue. It has been and will continue to be a pandemic long after the COVID pandemic has ended and is done." We did the show last week, and then when I went home and I turned on the laptop, and what I saw was indeed the private members bill on television being put through the door that day. And then the following night it was the National Maternity Hospital. So what I did is I got into contact with our very own Deputy Kathleen Funchion, and Kathleen Funchion is on the phone to tell us all about the private member bill, which was a Sinn Féin bill, a private members bill put in onto gender-based violence. Kathleen, you're very welcome back to the Woman to Woman show here on Community Radio Kilkenny City.
Thanks very much, Roisin. I feel like it's a while since we spoke, so it's good to be back. I'm particularly speaking about this issue that was, I suppose, brought into stark contrast with that horrific murder of Aisling Murphy, and I think that everybody is, I suppose, obviously horrified by that, but also really wanting to see this kind of start the changes that very much need to happen within society, and a lot of that is I suppose we need to start at the top, and we need to look at how we fund and how we resource some of our services. We don't adequately resource or fund our services such as the women's refuges. There's a lot of counties that don't have refuges still, where we only have a third of the beds that are required, for example. I know there's regularly fundraisers, and we've all seen the various fundraisers that come up on our social media, maybe squats for women's aid or walking for women's aid. I've done those myself, as have others, and we need to look at that, and we need to look at our court system. We need to look at the Gardaí and how they're resourced and how people are trained specifically to deal with this issue. And it's not acceptable that when cases go to court, they take what seems like forever to be processed, and then there's kind of question marks over exactly how sentences, I know particularly in the cases of rape, there doesn't seem to be consistency in terms of what sentence is passed down or what the length of that sentence is, and why is there suspended sentences sometimes issued in a lot of these cases. So there's a lot to be done around that, and then a huge big part of the problem is the fact that at the moment this doesn't fall to any one department. So part of it falls to justice, part of it falls to health, and part of it falls actually to the children's department, believe it or not, because a lot of the refuges are funded, well actually they're all majority funded by TUSLA. So it needs to be in one department, and the National Women's Council has been calling for that, and we would definitely echo those calls. There should be one department. We believe it should be in the office of An Taoiseach, so that it gets the seriousness, and there's a real spotlight on it, so that there is actual action. So they're just probably, I suppose, some of the issues. And then another part of the debate, and I know we heard a lot about this last week, not just in the Dála, but in general, and on the airwaves and everywhere, people talking about the culture and how do you change that and mindset, that might be an Irish culture. And one of the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality actually had a really, really good recommendation on relationship and sexuality, like education. So there is a certain amount of education, very limited, I suppose, currently in primary and secondary schools, and what they had suggested was that would be, an extensive kind of program that would look at the role of consent, gender power dynamics within relationships, how that works, what is a healthy relationship, how you kind of spot the signs, because a lot of the time people will tell you who are coming out of, whether it's physical or emotional abuse, like domestic abuse, that probably the signs were there maybe, or there was red flags, or they maybe didn't see the signs or didn't, put it all together. So I think a program like that would be really good. I think we should definitely prioritise that in our schools, and whatever resources need to be given should be, I think, applied to that. And I think that, I would say the vast majority of schools would be very supportive of that, but I certainly don't believe there should be any opt-out in relation to something like that.
And Kathleen, it should also be within the schools, but within the workplace as well.
Yeah, it should be. And actually that's another bill that's going to be coming through. It's past the kind of first stage in the job, but in relation to domestic violence leave, that there would be a 10 days paid leave for anybody in that situation. So if you had to obviously leave a home, or you're in that kind of a crisis situation, that that it gives it an optional. It's not going to be one solution. Obviously there's going to be a range of solutions for people, but it would be one thing where you have that 10 days earmarked as kind of additional or extra leave that you'd be able to access. And actually, in fairness, some employers are already offering that. Vodafone offers it, Danske Bank offer it, and I think the university in Galway has started that programme too, and there's talk of it being rolled out to other universities throughout the country too. So that's really positive. And while nobody wants to ever have to have that type of leave in place, it is important that it is there. And it should be said that will be accessible for everybody, for men also experiencing violence too, or not just violence, domestic violence, and that can be emotional too. And I think it's really important that we come back to that point time and time again, because sometimes people feel if it's not physical, it's not actually happening, and that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. And too, when you think about it, the having that leave, that paid leave, is really important, because when you have domestic violence, you have bruises, you have scars, you could have really muscular pain, if not broken bones. So you need that time to actually heal, and so you can go back to work with a bit of dignity as well. Yeah, definitely. It's important to have that, and I think just for somebody in that situation, I think it's just maybe a little bit of peace of mind, or a little bit of breathing space. Yeah. For example, particularly if you have to pack up and try and leave at home. Oh, yeah. And we see that time and time again. And it's not something I have an issue with as well. It's like and I can understand why, and I know it has to happen, particularly in the short term, but I do think we need to get better at trying to allow women and children to be the ones to stay safely in the home. There are often people leaving with 2, 3, 4 children, then trying to find accommodation, when their time maybe runs out in a refuge. That's not an easy situation at all. And I just think I understand why that has to happen when something is happening in the here and now. But certainly we need to get much faster and much better at dealing with it. Makes absolutely no sense for the person who is to be sitting in the home, And then you got, even in that time, you might, a woman might be leaving in a rush, fleeing for her life and the children's life, leaving all the school uniforms and everything behind. So you need that space to gather the children, make sure the children are okay, make sure the woman is okay, and then go back and maybe get the school uniforms and everything else with help there. And it's unacceptable, the culture within society, and also the stigma. The stigma needs to change, and it needs to change from legislation right down to local level within our communities as well.
Oh yeah, it definitely does. It needs, I do think it's important to kind of lead from the front as such, so it does need to be top down, and that's where the whole thing around those education and awareness programs come in. And I think you're right, I think in the workplace too, but I think it's really, really important that happens, because you can put everything into one department and provide the adequate resources, which would be great. I would love if that happened, but you do need to start changing the culture as well, and look at how we're kind of running some of those programs currently, and I think that's important. And then obviously I do think it's relevant as well in a lot of workplaces. And I think that's where the kind of 10 days paid leave comes in, because it does bring that whole conversation and topic up. And, it's very much kind of on the agenda and people are talking about it. And that's always a positive thing, because then maybe there's a chance for, that somebody else will feel, I suppose, they get a bit of courage from hearing that they do have a bit of support, and they might end up leaving a situation that they've been trying to leave for a very long time. And that's why I think we can't say it enough in relation to the work that Amber do in terms of the non-judgmental approach. It is key to this, because you will often hear people say, why didn't you just leave, or why can't you leave? And someone drifts back time and time again to that same relationship. And that's where Amber, they're so non-judgmental, they're there no matter what has happened or what is happening. And I just wanted to I suppose, take the opportunity to just say, commend them on all the work that they do. I mean, I think that part, the non-judgmental part, for me, is absolutely key in the whole thing.
Yeah, definitely. And, when you think about it too, it's the Amber, and you have been a strong advocate from Amber since I started the Woman to Woman show here in 2017, October 2017. You've always been vocal. You've always been a staunch supporter and an advocate for Amber. And I think that should be recognised too, Kathleen, the work that you have been put in for the last years, as I say, since you were county councillor as well. And really been vocal here in Kilkenny, and that support is greatly appreciated, not just by Amber, but I would imagine so from every woman who is living and experiencing domestic violence. I want to also talk about, when you think about domestic violence or coercive control and emotional abuse and financial abuse and everything else, it also attached to that is everyday sexism, harassment and misogyny within our society. It's a cultural thing too that needs to be actually addressed, from what is misogyny, what is harassment, and what is sexism, especially in the workplace and within school and within our communities.
Definitely, I think that's goes back to the whole kind of education situation, and I think that it's not called out enough and not spoken about maybe enough, and there's not enough awareness or education around it. I think that's really important, that anything that's done in terms of kind of additional resources needs to kind of bring this along with it. And even if we talk about consent, I think that really got thrown into focus during the trial that was in the media, maybe was it 2 or 3 years ago now at this stage of the trial, the alleged rape in Belfast, the whole thing about consent. And I think in certain circles there wasn't a huge amount of talk about it before that. So that shows how the kind of narrative maybe changed a little bit and on that whole situation. So that's important, that's why we kind of take this opportunity now to, when people are talking about domestic violence and potential additional resources or an increase in funding for that sector, which would be very welcome. It's important that we do this part alongside with it, and everything else that goes with it around, because there's so many stumbling blocks, or housing, the court situation, because if you leave and your name is still attached to a property, you might not be able to get onto the local authority housing list. And in fairness to them, they're just going by the rules that they have to kind of try and go by. So there's lots of kind of minefields, and you can see then how people just end up drifting back into that other very negative relationship.
Well, women in this country have really, really been let down, if you think all through our history. And what I want to go through now, we'll talk about it another day, is another bill that was put through last week was the private members' bill on the National Maternity Hospital. Kathleen, where are we on this? Because my research started off in 2008, 2013, and here we are in 2022, and where are we on this? Because there's still no clarity or understanding of what is happening here.
Yeah, and I think that probably sums it up in terms of that there isn't really much movement on it, and I suppose there's another issue as well in terms of who is actually going to have ownership of that, and is the church going to have a role or an involvement in it, and that would definitely not be welcome. And a lot of the things that we're talking about, it really needs to be what they call ethos-free, and certainly if it's a case that you want to have a state-of-the-art and a really great maternity hospital for women, and that would maybe have other services for women's health too, which would be brilliant. But if you're going to have potentially the church involved, and we know through history how negative that situation was for women when church and state got involved together, and Magdalene Laundries, mother and baby institutions, we definitely want to be coming away from that. It needs to be owned 100% by the state and operated by the state in the very best interest of women's health, regardless of what that means. It can't be people putting their own spins or opinions, or very often what happens in relation to women's health is their own judgments. And I would particularly use that word because that is exactly what it is. It's people's judgments. And for far too long in this country, we've had people thinking that they knew best in relation to women and in their health. Look at the cervical situation, the cervical scandal. Only for the bravery of Vicky Phelan, that would not have come out. That would not be public knowledge. We would have not known about that. That was people thinking that they knew best to cover up the whole situation. Look at everything that I just said in relation to women forced into institutions just because they were pregnant. So, we want to kind of get away fully from those days, and there's no point in apologies being issued and people saying how terrible and how horrible it is, and we want to learn from it, if you then develop a maternity and a women's health hospital that is somehow linked to the church. That's literally just taking 100 steps backwards. So I think that's the really important part, that when it does get up and running and developed, that it does have to be owned and controlled by the state in the best interest of women's health.
I agree with you, and I love my faith, but I tell you something, I don't agree with my faith and religious orders interfering with my health. I think that's just my personal opinion. Maybe I shouldn't be vocalising that, but when you think about it, this is the third time, I think twice last June, that a private member's bill or a motion went through the Dáil and the House of Oireachtas. And here we are in 2022, the third time this has gone through. When is enough enough? When can the government issue a compulsory purchase order?
They definitely can. I mean, you can CPO or compulsory purchase order, like if you have, valid grounds. So it's no reason why they couldn't. I suppose they won't, or there seems to be a reluctance certainly there on their part to do that, and probably a reluctance to have this whole debate properly. I mean, they obviously get debated at times during the Dáil, or if it's brought forward, like as you say, as a motion, but it doesn't ever seem to get past that, and you'd always hear the unanimous support, or everyone's kind of on the same page. But if we are, then why are we here still? I mean, I'm here now nearly 6 years. Next month will be 6 years, and it's certainly been on the agenda for all that time. And then you, I think, referenced 2008 and 2013 at the start there. So it's been going on a very long time, and sometimes there is a reluctance in terms of what I would say is political will to do it. I think it's just maybe the uncomfortableness for certain people around the debate, but I think it needs to happen, and I think, you know, we need to kind of plough ahead with that, and to think that there isn't really, though it's at that level of facility available. I mean, we've heard so much in relation to women and their health. You know, there was all of the stuff around the vaginal mesh a few years ago, and the scandal around that.
Yes.
I know that there was some scandal around people being tested for the BRCA gene, the breast, the cancer gene, and there was some mix-ups with that. There's the cervical check. There's people have been very vocal, particularly on national media in the last number of months, around menopause and the lack of services and supports that's there for that. So there's a lot, you know, and then there was all the things with that doctor in, I think, Louth, somewhere Dundalk with Drogheda,
that's right, yep.
The Dr. Nari, I think, if I'm correct, remembering his name correctly. So there was a number of scandals now at this stage. Surely we can just actually get going, and another thing as well that sometimes comes up with younger women is that how the cervical check is only available from the age of 25. You know, and if maybe some people have had a baby before that age, they're actually not entitled to the cervical check, the free cervical check, until they're over 25. And that's one that people might not think a lot about, but it does affect women. And again, it's an issue that affects women that's not being addressed, you know.
And the breast check as well, you have to be over 50 for the
breast
right,
check.
Yeah.
And
when you think about it, Kathleen, you know, I'm always astonished when you think about too that the Religious Sisters of Charity, apparently they had the Vatican approval, and from the Irish Catholic Bishops' Conference, and it comes under canon law, and so therefore the land of the hospital, you know, so there's a canon law, and then you've got the government, as you say, not is there the political will, is there the uncomfortableness of it all, and when you think about how women, you know, how we have been treated. When you think about from being airbrushed out of the historical photographs of the 1916, the 1921 rising, and when you think about even the marriage bar, divorce, the mother baby homes, the Adoption Act. I mean, when are we going to have equality? Now, we talked about this last week, and I won't keep you much longer, but you know. Now people are coming out and say, oh, you're hardcore feminist. No, hardcore feminism is completely different. I said from the suffragettes and from the early beginning of the century have been very strong feminists. It's not been anti-men or anything else. All we want is equality for ourselves and our daughters and granddaughters and the other following generations. Yeah, well, as somebody, I think I saw this post on social media that when you have 51% of the population being afraid to take a walk after a certain time in the day, I think that shows everything you need to know, that there is huge issues to be addressed, and the time for action is now. Like in fairness, we are more than half the population, so I would agree. I think looking for some equality is not overly radical, and I think that there's some of us who fight for equality, not just in relation to women, but in relation to lots of different things, our health service and housing and everything else. And to me, it's the exact same battle. It's just about, as you said, equality. It's all anybody wants. It's just to be treated equally and with equality. And Kathleen, I just think, and I've said all week, and I've said to everybody, I said what I've been saying for a long time, but I really do think maybe what we need is a new government department and another government department for a Ministry of Women for women and a Minister for Women as well, because there's too many debacles now and there's too much inequality. And you know, when are women going to actually be listened to and have a voice and be taken seriously, and where there will not be any more debacles or issues, and especially with domestic violence, our health, and all these issues for women and children for equality. Yeah, it's not a bad point. In fairness, it is possible that that's needed. I certainly think we'd be looking for the one department anyway to be dealing with a lot of the issues, and I certainly wouldn't have an issue if that
entailed having a minister, I think it's important that the action would follow through from all of that as well.
Yeah. Well, Kathleen Funchion, Deputy for Carlow, Kilkenny, as always, thank you so much. And thank you for being a voice for women and being such a Trojan voice for women, especially women who are living and experiencing domestic violence, and being a voice for women in your constituency. And you know what? We need more women like you in politics and more women in politics. We definitely do. And we need more men speaking out for women's rights and women's issues too.
Thanks very much, Roisin.
Well, have a good day, Kathleen, and stay well and stay safe. Do stay tuned with us. We'll be going for a short commercial break, and when we come back, we'll be talking to Orla O'Connor of the National Women's Council and Lisa Morris from the manager of the Amber Women's Refuge. Do stay tuned. You're very welcome back to the Woman to Woman show with me, Roisin Cleric. And before the break, we were talking to Carlow Kilkenny Deputy Kathleen Funchion, private members' bills on base violence and the National Maternity Hospital. Now on the phone, I'm delighted to introduce you back to the show. It's Orla O'Connor from the National Women's Council and Lisa Morris, who's a regular here on the Woman to Woman show, manager of the Amber Women's Refuge. Orla O'Connor, you're very welcome back to the Woman to Woman show here on Community Radio, Kilkenny City.
Good afternoon, Roisin. I'm really, glad that we're having this discussion about violence against women. I think it's really important. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. This is our second week chatting about it. And may I formally introduce you to Lisa Morris, the manager of Amber Women's Refuge.
Hi, Orla. Hi, Roisin. How are you doing? Thanks for having me back on.
Orla, I would say the National Women's Council is inundated with phone calls, press releases and talking to the press about domestic violence and gender-based violence and women, and in general women's place and the narrative of women within society. And last week we did a programme on changing the societal narrative within our culture on women living and experiencing and fleeing from domestic violence and then living within the community after leaving domestic violence. And the narrative has to change, doesn't it, about domestic violence and women living and experiencing domestic violence?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's been an extraordinary 3 weeks now in the country, just in terms of, I suppose, the outpouring of experiences from women, experiences of gender-based violence, of domestic violence, of sexual harassment. And I know I've said this is a watershed moment, but I really think it is, because I think there is now, throughout the country, a sense of we have to bring an end to violence against women, and we have to move into, a different culture, a different society that says this is wrong, and that we need much, much stronger action. Now, we're a long way off, and it is really dreadful that we're having this discussion, coming out of the horrendous killing of Aisling Murphy. And there have been women, each year there are women murdered, and most often it's women murdered at the hands of partners or ex-partners. And we absolutely need, we need to bring an end to this. And I think that's what people want, but we have a long way to go. And, you've rightly said the pieces there in terms of domestic violence. Like right now, it's not good enough that we don't have a refuge in every county, and even where we have refuge spaces, that there are waiting lists. And I'm sure Lisa can talk much better on this than me. But when a woman looks for support, it's so hard for her to do that. To call, to look for support, and we want a situation where at the moment when a woman does that she receives full support, wraparound support. That do everything to make her situation better in that critical time of leaving an abusive partner. And we are a long way off from that.
Absolutely, and I agree with you, Orla. I think we do need to cultivate a zero tolerance for misogyny and sexism in our homes, but not only in our homes, in our workplaces. When we speak with our friends, obviously we know men's violence against women exists on a continuum. So, and what does start as with sexist jokes, so-called banter, and those different types of sexist behaviour, this is what we need to stop as well. And that small step towards change by calling that out and calling it out for what it is. as we know, that can lead to controlling and abusive behaviour, but it also can end then in rape and murder. So what people think they're doing is harmless jokes. It's not. And I think that's where we need to call that out, because it's not, and it's also not enough for men to say that they don't use violence, but we can't excuse violence when we see it, and we must not be silent about violence, and it's everyone's part to play in ending this. And also, like you said, you know, the domestic and sexual gender-based violence sector has been chronically underfunded for years as well in Ireland. Like local domestic violence services like ours, we run vital services to protect women and children, but we do that with significant shortfalls in funding every year, and we're always trying to, you know, get money from some different grant or some different funding, and it's not good enough. We need a stronger infrastructure. Now, we were happy with the recent announcement by Minister for Justice Helen McEntee that domestic, sexual and gender-based violence will be located in a single ministry under her department with oversight from the Taoiseach's office. But I, along with a lot of my colleagues and as well yourself, Orla, we await the publication of the strategy, and we really need them not just to talk lip service. It needs to be a really significant change and step forward for victims of gender-based violence in Ireland.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think, you know, as well, Lisa, that, you know, all of the push at the moment, and rightly so, you know, we are seeing an increase in reporting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're seeing more women come forward, but that needs to come with then a significant increase in support for the services, because they're already coming from a position of, as you were describing there, struggling, having to fundraise, having to get grants. And now we're looking at a period, and, you know, which is positive in one way in terms of people, you know, more women coming, reporting, seeking support. But the services absolutely have to be funded to meet that.
They do.
And we are such a long way off. And, you know, I completely agree that this strategy that the government will announce, that's going to be critical. And, like, there will be many actions in that. And, you know, I'm sure that we'll be agreeing with them. But unless the funding and resources comes behind them, then it'll be a report on the shelf again.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Like we need
funding is critical.
Yeah, and we need the wraparound services from the crisis stage to the recovery stage. It's not just,
exactly.
You know, we do need more refuge spaces, but there's lots other services that we need. They need to put significant and sustainable funding into. You know, we do. Yeah. Carlow is one of the. We're currently funded to provide refuge for Kilkenny and Carlow, but Carlow is one of the counties that doesn't have, one of the 9 counties that doesn't have a refuge space of its own. And we know that there's only 140 refuge spaces in the 28 counties, which is approximately a third of the required spaces in the country. So that alone is such a lack of resources. We are constantly turning away women to the refuge. We have. We had 101 women last year that we weren't able to accommodate.
Wow.
And we've seen a huge increase also. I know this is across the country, but we have seen a 161% increase in children receiving refuge in last year's statistics, and we've seen 46% increase in women using refuge. So it's the statistics are on the rise, and it's not that, and I know long after COVID is gone, this shadow pandemic of domestic and sexual gender-based violence will still be here, and will still need significant resources and a proper infrastructure for us to be able to follow through with change and changing everything that needs to happen around this, I think.
Yeah, totally. And I think as well that, you know, there is a moment where this is very much, you know, in people's minds. I think, you know, and a greater awareness, I think, as well from what's happened in COVID in terms of, you know, the focus on domestic violence. But we also know that, you know, issues go off the boil as well. So I think it's really important, I think, to keep the pressure on, to keep the conversations going. I mean, that's why this discussion today, I think, is really important. But to keep this happening in communities, and in the Women's Council at the moment, we're being contacted by, you know, community organisations, sporting organisations, men's organisations about how to become, you know, how to get involved, how to be part of this. And I think that's really important. But we have to, you know, we have to sustain that. And just to say, one of the things that the Women's Council that we're doing on the 5th of March on Saturday, so just before International Women's Day, we're going to have a rally in Dublin, and violence against women is going to be a key part of that, because we know, and I mean, part of it is because people want to do something, but it's also about keeping the pressure on, because, you know, if there isn't significant change right now at this moment when, you know, it really is up there, I think, in the public's minds, well then when will it happen? Exactly,
and it's so unfortunate that it happens after a woman is murdered in this country. But I suppose that's what we have to take on board now, is that, you know, people are coming together and they want change as well, but it needs to stay in the media now. We need to be talking about it still, and we need to have those conversations, and even we need to talk to our sons and our daughters about the basics of respect and consent and equality. And I think, you know, as parents and as educators, that's what we need to do. We need to have those conversations, and if they're difficult, like, seek support in having those conversations with your children. And even in groups where you don't feel comfortable, I suppose it's having the confidence to say, well, this isn't appropriate, we shouldn't be talking in this way. It's just having that confidence to step up and say enough is enough. Those small steps will really make change, I think.
I absolutely agree. And I mean, you know, when we look at big changes that have happened in this country, you know, they've come from those conversations in communities, conversations around kitchen tables, because they're the things that bring about change. And we need to do this now on gender-based violence. And I also think, you know, when you were saying earlier about, you know, this is a continuum, and I completely agree. And I do think that we need to look at, I mean, I'm just so, you know, conscious from so many of the stories, you know, that women have spoken about and their experiences of harassment, and to what it's to such an extent that it's almost been normalised in part and parcel of growing up, part and parcel of being a woman, and you know, coming to a point where we're calling that out much earlier. And I think part of that is looking at our legislation on harassment and looking at, you know, how can we take it more serious at an early point. Yes. But also the changes that need to happen in our education system, and primary, secondary, third level, because, you know, the way it is at the moment, you know, modules being done in schools, groups coming in to give a talk, you know, that's all good, but there needs to be something much more systemic that's part of the curriculum, and that schools, you know, they're obliged to include this.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I know ourselves in Kilkenny, we only, you know, we get we deliver our schools talk, and it's at transition year level, so we know that's not, you know, we're not coming in at a time where we know that prejudices and biases are formed at a really young age, so that's where you need to be. Early intervention is key. So there must be greater emphasis in the curriculum at primary as well as post-primary level, and again on equality, respect and consent. They you know, that needs to be the emphasis, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing, like, there is such good work being done in this, in terms of, you know, the talks or the programs that are happening in schools, but it's getting that, you know, in every school, and also getting the type of programs that, and I think they really do need to be led by services like yourself, by women with the experience of this, so that it's, you know, it really is making sense to people, and it's getting to the heart of the issues.
Absolutely.
And before we go to our break, we just have to go for an ad break. But Orla and Lisa, you tweeted, was Amber or yourself? Amber tweeted the other day that Amber Women tweeted that 21% of workers in Kilkenny, Carlow, who said they experienced domestic violence, get physical threats from the abuser during their workday. The impact of domestic abuse on the workplace. And, you know, we really do have to have maybe an education within workplaces as well as within the educational system.
Yeah, and I suppose that's one of our strategic aims at the moment, is to try and build a relationship with the corporate sector and workplaces across Kilkenny and Carlow. So we have been working on that at the moment, and we are trying to encourage local businesses and local organisations to come forward for us to help educate them around these issues, and also to help write domestic abuse workplace policies and how they can manage and encourage anyone that is experiencing domestic violence to come forward and seek help, so that HR managers and companies would be able and would be confident to be able to deal with those cases, because, you know, it's 1 in 4 women. So if you look at that across the workplace, people are dealing with this every day, and it's just been ignored, and women aren't supported, and they don't feel comfortable enough with coming forward. So that's definitely a key aim of ours over the next year or so, to try and build that and to try and encourage organisations, workplaces to come forward and to lead the way, even in Kilkenny and Carlow, to lead the way and lead by example, and show that they're interested in this topic and that they're dedicated to change, and that they're going to do something within the workplace to support victims coming forward for help.
And I think what should be added into that is sexism, misogyny and harassment within the workplace as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, Orla and Lisa, we're going to go for a break. Orla, you'll stay with us, I hope, until after the end of the programme. We're going to go for a break, and maybe when we come back, we'll talk more about sexism, misogyny and how we can change the narrative at local levels within our community. So do stay tuned.
We are Community Radio Kilkenny City 88.7 FM.
You're very welcome back to the Woman to Woman show here on Community Radio Kilkenny City, where we are in conversation with Lisa Morris from the Amber Women's Refuge and from Orla O'Connor from the National Women's Council. Orla, we've just had a message in and it says, I wonder if you can ask Orla O'Connor, we have spoken on national level on dangers of women working from home brought to the people who are in domestically abusive situation. On the other hand, working from home has been a godsend for many, as it's meant an escape from sexual harassment within the workplace, which is very much present despite denials that people have been trying to cling on to. Has the National Women's Council heard similar from their members?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's been legislation on sexual harassment, but we know that it continues in our workplaces. And I think it really does show that, whereas, to tackle every different type of abuse and violence, yes, we need legislation, but then we also need lots of other changes as well to ensure that that's effective. So, I mean, what we're saying is there needs to be more conversations in workplaces about what sexual harassment is. Employers need to take a much stronger stance, both in terms of the awareness, but also in terms of stepping up to the plate and making sure that it's dealt with appropriately. But it is about changing our culture in workplaces as well. And I mean, I think there some companies you can see more recently have taken some positive initiatives which have brought the issue more out in the open. I mean, I'm conscious, for example, Vodafone has introduced initiatives in the domestic violence area, for example. I think Air is going to follow suit. And they're important. They're important for not just the initiatives, but because it brings the conversation up and it becomes a workplace where these things aren't tolerated. And that's really important because, yes, there is the legislation, but we have to change the culture because we know it still exists.
Absolutely. And how do we, from your perspective, and your perspective as the National Women's Council perspective, and Lisa's perspective, manager of the Amber Women's Refuge here in Kilkenny, how do we change the narrative of women living and experiencing domestic violence and then leaving, and then in the recovery stages, as Lisa said, because there is life after domestic violence, but it's that sort of time. Women are never forgiven for saying that the stigma, they're not forgiven to say that their husband was violent to them, and still in 2022. So how would you say we change that narrative, Orla?
Well, I think there's a few things. I mean, the first thing in relation to domestic violence is our understanding of it, and I think for a long time we've understood domestic violence as to be physical, only in a physical violence sense. So there was a real lack of understanding, and still is, as to the nature of domestic violence, the impact it has, the impact it has on women, on children, on communities, and also how still it is surrounded by shame and stigma. And I think part of which is a positive piece is now we're talking about coercive control and domestic abuse, and we're seeing it in a different frame than physical violence. So we're talking about emotional and psychological control, we're talking about financial control. So we're seeing domestic violence now in a much bigger frame, which is the reality of it. But I certainly think that while it's really positive that we have an offence of coercive control, I think within the wider society that's not fully understood. It's not fully understood what it is, what it means. And I also think for many women in domestic violence and abusive situations that it's not also understood that lots of this is actually a crime and criminal, and support is there. So it's it is complex, and it's it's very difficult for a woman in a situation of domestic abuse to be able to access supports because of the controlling situation in which she's living in. And that's why it's so important, and Lisa mentioned this earlier, about the need for wraparound supports. So the moment that woman is, looking for help, that she receives wraparound supports. And it's also important in terms of, when speaking about this with other people, that there is that understanding. So, what I think when I think about cultural change in relation to issues like this, it is about having conversations, conversations in communities, conversations in whether it's in, civil society organisations, in sporting organisations, in workplaces, because we know that domestic violence affects so many people and so many families, and yet it's still very hidden.
Yeah.
It's still a taboo, swept under the carpet topic and issue.
It really is as well, and I think we need to change the narrative as well around victim blaming and victim shaming and we need to stop blaming women for men's actions, and we need perpetrators to be held accountable. That's the other thing. I think that's where we need to shift the conversation and change it back to, why did he do that, instead of asking the woman, why, like the question, why doesn't she leave? Why does she put up with that? I think that's a massive thing that we need to change as well, is the way we talk about these domestic abuse cases, and to stop blaming women.
And I think as well, like, one of the issues is that, and it's part of that support piece, but, when women do, if it is about seeking refuge support or do try to leave or get orders, they also face significant trauma, difficulty in our family court process.
Absolutely.
So there's so many women going through situations where, they may have received safety orders, their lives might be under threat, and then they're back trying to argue issues of access and fight in family courts when they're, extremely traumatised, and yet they're having to go into family courts and fight issues around access.
Yeah.
So we don't have a default in Ireland that where domestic abuse exists, that everything should stop until, it can be proven that access can be provided in a safe way. Whereas that's not what we have in Ireland. You have to constantly sort of fight in the courts. And it's one piece of this that really needs to radically change.
Yeah, I 100% agree. That would be a start. Like, it's such a huge conversation. It's so complex. I think there's so much that needs to change. But I think if we can all just take part in small steps do lead to bigger change. And I do, we do await the publication of the national strategy, and I just really hope that it has meaningful, sustainable actions that will help in leading towards this change that we all want and that is needed in our society.
Yeah.
And backed up with action, with money,
to
support the words and the document that they're producing, the legislation. They need to back it up with money and funds and make it accessible straight away without delay.
Yeah.
Well,
absolutely.
Definitely. And you know what? Women's lives matter, children's lives matter, all lives matter. And you know what? And our home is supposed to be a sanctuary and a sacred place, and we need to get that back for many, many women and children. And, I know we can talk about men, but this is a woman-to-woman show where we talk about women's issues. My colleagues often have men's aid on, but we concentrate on women's issues here on the Woman-to-Woman show. And Orla, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you for giving us the time.
Thanks, Lisa.
And
you too, Orla.
Maybe we can get you down here and we can physically all meet up sometime in 2022. That would be lovely.
Absolutely. That would be really good. Thank you.
Well, Orla O'Connor, thank you so much indeed, and it's been lovely speaking to you, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're coming to the end of the Woman to Woman show. Lisa, you've been a regular contributor here since 2019.
Yes,
January
so.
2019.
Yes.
I mean, you think that, I can't believe, I still think we're in 2020 with the pandemic.
I think we've lost a few years, Roisin. So it seems a lot shorter.
Yes. So we've been highlighting this here, and it's taken, when you think about it, it's taken since January 2019 to get this talking nationally.
Absolutely. Sure. I'm working in the services for 16 years, and we're still having the same conversations. So I really think, you know, it's time that we make change, and, you know, it's great to see all those people come forward in vigils and rallies, and I just think we have to make this change now. And it will take time, and it will take a lot of effort by everyone, but I think, you know, we can hopefully invest in that change. And can I just give out our helpline number as well, Roisin, if that's okay? So if anyone is in an abusive situation or knows somebody that's in an abusive relationship, our helpline number is 0818 42 42 44. And we're a 24-hour service if anyone needs to reach out to us.
And if anybody forgets that number, just ring the station and we'll get the number out to you. I want to thank my guests today, Deputy Kathleen Funchion, Orla O'Connor from the National Women's Council, and Lisa Morris from the Amber Women Refuge. Do stay well and stay safe.
Kilkenny City 88.7 FM.